Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. Amen.
Sara is doing double duty today, and I brought you. I brought
something. Okay, here we are.
Hi.
Hi.
I specifically asked for you to come and talk to me about this because, as one of our prayer leaders, I wanted to make sure that we talked about prayer in sort of the discernment process.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're comfortable with it, I would be curious. Earlier we had a list of things up there about ways of knowing. What's kind of your preferred way of knowing?
Well, I did go immediately to prayer, but it also came to me that nature is a big part of it. So I feel like I can find the inner voice, the still small voice that I try to cultivate in prayer. I find that clearest for me when I'm out in the world, in nature. So, and Jan pointed out, and I think this was a true and good point, that nature allows silence, and that our world is so noisy that a lot of times it's hard to find the silence to hear that voice. So I think those two things go together. I do a lot of conversation too. But I think in the end, people will say, like, inside of yourself what is the right thing to do. And that's, like, way too much pressure. So it is, yeah. Like, I don't know. I don't know anything. So talking to lots of people who know me is really important. And people who have wisdom that I don't have is important. But in the end, I think it comes down to being able to hear what is happening inside, and I feel like that is cultivated through the practice of prayer. I was really excited to hear you talking about the practice of discernment, and that feels a little hard to grasp for me, practicing discernment. But practicing prayer is something that I feel like is very important, and when it comes time to make decisions, that is the key.
I love that you said, my microphone's not working. So I love that you said people you know. Oh, that's we can pass it back. Sharing is caring. I love that you said people that you know. Because people you know and who know you give a different type of advice than like random people on the bus. Right? Like, discernment isn't like picking somebody at McDonald's and saying, what do you think I should do? Right? That's not the practice of discernment. By the way, preparing for this talk, for our conversation this week, brought up a lot of weird memories. Because through my Christian life for 25 years now, I've tried various ways of like trying to know God's will. And some of them have worked great. And some of them have worked well like in a season, and then others of them have been a complete flop. So I thought, have you ever had something that flopped?
Well, I mean, I think that it's all well and good to sit here and talk about like the practice of prayer and whatever. And then I was thinking after I said that. No, that was me. Okay, so I'm gonna backtrack a little bit.
That's the worst impression of me I've ever heard.
No, I was talking about me. I don't know how to do an impression of that story you just told me. I'm gonna let it go.
It's probably best.
So I feel like in conjunction with that, like quiet prayer, nature walk, yada yada yada, there is often in my discernment process, there's often a lot of like tears and like raging, like, God, why won't you help me? That is a common theme in like me trying to make big decisions, is this like sort of desperation. And I think you were talking about that earlier in the homily, that people come to you with this like sort of desperation, like, what do I do in this moment? And I do get that desperation thing. I usually get it alone in my bedroom, sort of like screaming at God, help me. But I think that is the result of not cultivating the practice of quiet prayer, because then it turns into like this chaotic, like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I don't know. I think that the thing that helps me the most, and this is a thing that I probably have talked about with lots of you before, is this practice of centering prayer. And there's a major teacher of centering prayer whose name is Father Thomas Keating, and he's written some books about it. And I've gone to some workshops where we listen to his talks and then talk about them. Anyway, so there's one talk that Father Thomas Keating gave where he was talking about the desire to sit in silence with God, and the fact that we sit in silence with God allows us to be able to hear the Spirit when the Spirit is speaking to us. Cultivating silence, which is another thing that Jan was talking about, that the noise in our culture or whatever. And so he was just giving an example of a time where he was feeling something that didn't make a lot of sense, but it seemed like it kept coming back, and it kept coming back, and that if he hadn't been cultivating silence and cultivating that desire to hear God's voice, he wouldn't have known to follow that nudge. And I don't know, this is a thing that I feel like has happened in my life. And in our group, Katie and I were talking about just having a feeling of what is the thing to do. But how do we quantify what that feeling is, and how do we know when to follow it and when not to? And I think the only way to do that is to practice listening for the Spirit. It doesn't speak to us through random people on the street. It speaks to us through practice.
So today is Reformation Sunday. All over the world, Protestants are celebrating, which 500 years ago, right? We had the Protestant Reformation 501 years ago. So that's why I wore my red pants and my red socks today, by the way. That's what you're supposed to do, and we don't really do that, but technically, Protestant on Reformation Sunday, you're supposed to wear red, so I did that, so you're welcome. I took care of it for us. But one of the things that Martin Luther was one of the main reformers, and Luther had this idea I want to tell you about because I think it's fascinating. Luther had this idea called Pastoria Dei, the backside of God. Pastoria Dei. And Luther said you can only know that it was God afterwards. You didn't know in the moment. You only knew it was God on the backside. And I love this concept because sometimes in the American church, we are so into presence and glory and blessing and health and wholeness and healing and sparkling and shining and smiling that in the moment it's tough to know what's God and what's not. Well, you know a tree by its fruit, right? That's what Jesus said. We talk about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, patience, and self-control. That's how you know God's been around, when those things start to show up. So I just wanted to, on this Reformation Sunday, I just wanted to introduce you to the idea of the Pastoria Dei, the backside of God. You can always tell when God's been at work a couple weeks later, afterwards. And I think that there's a humility in that we watch out for each other. Because sometimes, in the moment, you had to make a major decision a couple weeks ago about a job. And you knew to turn down one job, and as soon as you did, a different job opened up. And somehow you knew, you had peace that was the job for you, right? But let's say that decision didn't go so well. Part of our job as a community is to hold that space for you, and then afterwards to say, hey, remember how you made the decision? That turned out pretty good. That was probably God's Spirit guiding you. And then you can have confidence the next time, because of the posterior day, after God passed, you knew it was God. And then the next time you can go in with confidence and say, I remember that experience, and I have that same unquantifiable feeling right now.
Totally. Yeah, I think that is so true, that trust and discernment lead to trust and discernment. So that the fact that you can have the feeling and the understanding, this does not make sense, but I just know it's the right thing to do, the next time you can be like, well, it worked out that time, so maybe I should go with this flow here.
So as we wrap up, we're going to do a quick commercial for the book. This chapter in the book is really good. I hope that you're reading it. If you haven't picked up the book yet, we have a couple copies left on the welcome table. Is there anything in the book you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that I often think about God's plan for my life, right? So there is like a thing that I'm following, and it's for my life. This very kind of ego thing, which until I read this chapter, I hadn't really thought about. So I'm going to read you just like the definition of discernment in this chapter. Discernment is the intentional practice by which a community or an individual seeks, recognizes, and intentionally takes part in the activity of God in concrete situations. Okay, so this is like versus me trying to find God's plan for my life. This is more I had an understanding of God has a plan for goodness, and I'm a cog in that plan, as opposed to there being like a plan for my life. Do you see what I mean? Like, do you see the difference? So that was something that I thought was really interesting. There are lots of things I think to talk about in this chapter, things that I did not necessarily agree with so much. But also there are lots of bits of wisdom. So yeah, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had.
Thanks. Can we thank Sara for coming and talking?